Hello again. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have fellow author Ben English. Ben, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, sir. I'm pleased to be here.
So, Ben, you are our first podcast author who is generally from Alpine, Big Bend, and that part of Texas. So, we're going to talk about your upbringing, how that has influenced your writing. But I wanted to start with if you could just tell us a little bit about your history because it is fascinating.
Thank you, sir. They have that ancient saying, Chinese saying, may you live in interesting times, and how it can be a blessing or a curse. And it can be both for me also, but mostly a blessing. I was born in Uvalde in 1958. My first winter on this earth as a baby was spent in the JA Ranch in the Panhandle of Texas. My grandfather had been sheriff of Zavala County, and he was on his second term. He was offered to be the chance to be a foreman up there at the JA. So we all moved up there to the Panhandle. That lasted one winter, and my grandfather decided that was no place for a South Texas boy to be. And about that time, my great aunt Mag Smith, you hear people hear about her along the river quite a bit in the lower Big Bend. She was like a legend down there. She was a blood English, little sister of my great grandfather. They've even written books about her. Anyway, she was running the Hot Springs Trading Post for at that time, and my dad always said that granddad's idea of vacation was always to pack up and spend about 1 or 2 weeks down there with Aunt Mag because he loved that country so much. Anyway, she called him up and said Rex Ivy is moving to Alpine. He's leasing out the Lahitas Trading Post. If you've ever wanted to come to Big Bend, the time is now. So we went. And that's my earliest memories. I grew up in that country. We had five different ranches down there. My grandparents stayed down there all those years. My dad and my mom. Dad sold cars for cashers and tried to cowboy on the side. And finally, we just packed up, moved down there also. When I reached sixth grade, I had to go to another school because the Terlingua school was only one room, 6 grades with 9 students. So we packed up again and I went to Fort Stockton. Graduated from Fort Stockton in 1976. Recruited immediately in the Marine Corps. Went in the Marine Corps. I was 17 years old. I was 5'6", 116 pounds. I was a mountain of a man. And of course, I had to go ground infantry, a grunt. Spent the next 7 years in the Marine Corps. Ended up being Chief Scout Sniper, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marine. I take that back. I was Scout Sniper for 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, Chief Scout Sniper for 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. Was recruited into counterintelligence, and I re-upped at that time. And I ended up spending time in 30 different countries of 4 different continents, and I sailed many a blue sea. People ask me, well, you ever been to Germany or France or Italy, these other places, civilized places? I said, no. If you looked at the world as far as being a monopoly board, I was strictly in the low rent districts down around Mediterranean Avenue and Baltic Avenue and things like that. Mostly Central South America, West Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. After 7 years, I decided to pull the pin. Went to Angelo State University, earned a degree and bachelor's degree in government, and graduated with honors, magna cum laude, who's who in American colleges and universities, that sort of thing. Was recruited immediately into the Texas Highway Patrol, the DPS. I spent my next 22 years as a Texas Highway Patrolman working out of Ozona, Texas, 70 miles of interstate in my county, a town with no police department, and you're 40 air miles or so from the river. So I stayed gainfully employed all the time. I retired from the Highway Patrol when I was 50. That was my 50th great birthday present to myself because being in the Highway Patrol is a young man's game. I spent the next 2 years teaching high school. Really enjoyed that. And all the while, I've been wanting to come back home, back to the Big Bend. And it just never did work out. By the time there were some openings here, I had already had kids. My son's going to school. My wife had a job there. We bought a home in Ozona. So I stayed there until I retired. But in around 2014, we got the itch again. We came back home. I've been here ever since. Started writing. My first book was published in 2017, and my sixth one just came out.
So I've knew a lot of Marines who served in Vietnam. I've known Marines after Vietnam, but I've never talked to a Marine immediately who served immediately after Vietnam. What was the Corps like? Did the nation's malaise of the late 70s impact the Corps, or is the Corps always the Corps?
I came in about 6 months after Mag West. And like I said, went infantry. I never noticed it other than the equipment. I remember our 45s were last rebuilt in 1946. When I went infantry, I ended up being a motorman. I selected for 60 mic mics and 81 mic mics. And I remember looking at the 60 mic bipod from my motor. It was stamped June of 1941. Our M16s, a lot of those were the original M16s. I had one was stamped XM177E2 and it didn't have a forward assist on it. And you knew that you weren't exactly the top of the list of Uncle Sam as far as paying for equipment and things of that nature. But our drill instructors were still Marine drill instructors. We were still Marine ground infantry. And we took a great deal of pride in that. The Marine Corps is kind of a different animal. When you go to boot camp in the Marine Corps, you have an entire course on Marine Corps history to remind you not only who you are, but what you represent and what others have done in the past. My wife tends to think that they brainwashed me, but hey, and both of my sons ended up going into Annapolis. They graduated from Annapolis. One flew Harriers for the Marine Corps, and the other one was a Mark 6 patrol boat skipper for the Navy in the Persian Gulf. So it's kind of, as my nephew says, it's a family business.
So I have interviewed one author who wrote his first book after the age you began. What got you, or what motivated you to write your first book? Did you just have a story that you had to get out? Did your wife say, honey, you've got to tell these stories? What motivated you?
This may sound strange, but it is the truth. When I was 10 years old, going to a one-room schoolhouse in the middle of Chihuahua in the desert, I wanted to be three things. I wanted to be a U.S. Marine, I wanted to be a Texas Highway Patrolman, and I wanted to be a successful writer. And in fact, when I started writing, I had to get into social media, which I had avoided religiously up to that point. And one of my teachers from Terlingua made contact with me. And she said, I always knew you were going to become something, but I was always kind of scared of what. But those are three things I wanted to do. I got the Marine Corps underneath my belt. I got the Highway Patrol underneath my belt. I got to think, I need to write. And I wrote my first book, Yonderings. And that was with the help of two great people, published authors, fairly well-known Texas authors, Marshall Doddlestall and Bill Wright. Bill he wrote a book, in fact, on my great Aunt Mac down from on the river. And my wife, I'm talking about wives, jumped in there. So Ben does a little writing too. Of course, I just kind of went, yeah, like this. And anyway, Bill, being the eternal gentleman that he is, said, what do you write about? I said, oh, I don't do any writing other than every time I go down to Big Bend, when I could get away from the job and such, I'll write a little short story and send it out through my email. He goes, that's good. He goes, send me some. I said, so I picked up my latest one, sent it to him through the email. Came back, goes, you deserve to be published. How can I help this happen? I said, what do you want? He said, I want a series of short stories just like you sent me about growing up there and returning and how the changes were and what's in your mind and such. So it took me about less than 6 months to get it together. I made contact with me and Bill said, Ben, I'm sorry. My wife is dying. I can't help you right now, but I'm putting you in contact with Marshall Doddlestall, who is another sterling individual. And I sent the manuscript to Marcia. She came back, says, don't show this to anybody else. Don't send it to anybody else. I've already got it in for you, TCU Press. And TCU Press picked it up immediately and run with it. In fact, we're 7 going on 8 years later, and they say it's still number 2 in their catalog.
Wow. I was going to ask you something, and now I'm going to go in a completely different direction.
Just whichever way you want to go, sir. My wife says the main problem is getting me to shut up because I'm motivated about this.
Then you'll appreciate this next statement. Do not call me sir. I am not an officer. I'm really interested in your move to fiction because I've written a lot of nonfiction, generally business books, but also long essay forms, and I have struggled with fiction. How did you make the transition from these great stories that you were literally a part of or you were observing to fiction? Or is it really all just the same? Your fiction is just the stories you heard and saw.
It's kind of a mixture. That's an interesting question. I never even give it a second thought. My second book was I call it historical fiction because there's when you read one of my works of fiction, if I talk about a spring or a tanaha or a trail or a fence line or ruins or a hill or a creek, you can just about bet it's there, or at least it was at one time because the country changes. So that's one thing. I keep it. I've got a great deal of. I've always been an amateur historian, and when I was a kid, we didn't have TV. We didn't have radio except battery powered at night, and usually that was a Mexican station. So people sat around and they talked. They told stories. And my family had been in that country for 6 generations, a long time before they was apart. So I had all these stories in my mind. Then I have all these people that I served with. I've had people say, you did this, that, something else in this world. You're a hero. I said, no, I'm not a hero. I just did my job. I said, but I had the honor and the pleasure of standing shoulder to shoulder with men who were heroes right to the very end. And when I look for one of my characters, my fictional characters are not a fictional character. They're people that I've known for good or for bad. And so 22 years of Texas Highway Patrolman, you run into the worst. And so it's a mixture of all that. It's a mixture of interest in history. It's a mixture of a passion for land that can only be described as singular and magical. And that's what I write about. I just never thought when you read my first historical novel, Destiny's Way, it actually takes place on an old ranch that we had. That's what the ranch was, my dad's headquarters. And you read these episodes of Supernatural, those actually happened to my family down there when we were living in that place. That was the old Fulcher place. The Fulchers were some of the first pioneers into that country. So I hope that kind of explains how this all came about in the fiction. It's like I said, to me, it's like comes naturally. I was talking to that fourth grade teacher again. She goes, you always had a great imagination. I said, yes, ma'am. It always get me trouble in school too, but actually I'm getting paid for it now.
There you go. So I grew up in Bryan. I spent 40 years practicing law in Houston, and I moved to the Hill Country. And I thought I had come to West Texas. But our friend Elaine Capers said, no, Tom, you do not live in West Texas. You live in the Hill Country. I come from West Texas. So I was wondering if I could maybe use that introduction to ask you a couple of different questions. One
Sure.
is what makes where you live now West Texas, as opposed to anybody who thinks anything west of Austin is West Texas? Number one, and then how does that the soul of where you live, as unique a place in Texas as there is, how do you put that into your stories? And you told us a little bit about that in your fiction work, but what's West Texas to you, and how do you put that soul in your stories?
It's interesting you bring that up because if you talk to people around here that say, you live in West Texas, said, no, we live in the Big Bend. And you talk to people out by El Paso, and they'll say, no, we live in El Paso. Or you talk to people in the Pecos River Canyon country there, you say you're from West Texas, say, no, we're from the Pecos River Canyon country. And you talk to people up in the Panhandle, and they tell you darn fast that they're from the Panhandle, not West Texas. So it breaks up further and further. But trying to answer your question, my second hitch in the Marine Corps, I was selected for counterintelligence. We didn't have a counterintelligence school. So they sent us to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, to an Army officers course out there. I went there twice, one for basic counterintelligence. The other course was an interrogation of prisoners of war. And when most of the guys were out chasing skirts and hanging around the bars and such, I had my Alice pack and I was headed out in that country because that was Chiricahua Mountain Country. That was Cochise. That was Geronimo. That was General Crook. That was Mickey Free, Apache Indian scout. It was actually a white man. And I saw the history they had. And of course, you turn on the TV, okay, big one back when I was a kid, High Chaparral, which was a really good TV Western. You go to the movies. We just had how many movies made about Tombstone now? So they had a lot of history there, but I'm looking around and say, yeah, they got a lot of history here, but we have so much more in what we would call the Trans-Pecos, West Texas area. They had the Chiricahua Apache. We had the Mescalero and the Lipan. We also had Kickapoo. We had Black Seminole. We had Comanche. We had Kiowa. We had a river. We had border raiders. We had so much more history. The history of this country, people come down here and say, oh, this is a new land. No, it's not. It's a very old one. One of the first string of presidios was put in by one of the Irish Red Geese, who ended up being Governor General of both Coahuila and Texas during Spanish rule. And he established forts, presidios, along that river from Tucson, away from the river, from Tucson, along the river, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, what are they going to call it now? But that was in 1773. That was 3 years before we had our revolution. There's so much history there, so much to choose from. So to me, it's easy to write. And there's so many different places I've been to. Like I said, I've been all over the world, but I can show you places in this country. If you're ever going to film a movie, preferably probably a science fiction one on another world, the Big Bend would be a very good place to go film it. Because whatever you can come up with as far as terrain, you pretty much find in this country.
I think I read that you currently live in Alpine.
Yes, sir.
And I've been to Alpine, and one of the things that surprised me was I saw a very vibrant literary and book scene in Alpine. If I interpreted that correctly, could you tell us a little bit about being an author and some of the bookstores or bookstore that you really enjoy in Alpine?
We have Front Street Books here, who is the bookstore in the area. They handle some of my work. I think they handle all of it. Then we have a lot of gift shops. Got one place that handles all my autograph copies of my books. It's actually called the Staple Performance Cars. It's run by a retired border patrolman, but he really enjoys my writing, so he stocks all my books, and they're all autographed. But we have gift shops. We have the bookstore itself, and we also have a university here, a state university. A university has been here for over 100 years now. And that brings a lot to the scene. And Alpine has always been a conglomeration of people and thoughts and backgrounds. You walk down the main street of Alpine, even when I was a kid, you had your hippies, you had your cowboys, you had your National Park Service people, you had Border Patrol, you had Texas Rangers, you had Highway Patrolmen, you had your local business merchants who could write a book about in itself being involved in the revolution, the Mexican Revolution. It was always very vibrant. It was like everybody's got their own ideas, everybody's got their own background, and we may discuss it, but we'll all get along together because we respect each other.
I'd like to turn to your latest book release, Cristeros. Could you tell us, give us maybe a teaser of that book and what challenges you faced in the writing process?
All right is a term used for the Catholic faithful who were forced into rebellion by the Mexican government from 1926 to 1929. There's a lot of history here, and for the next 70 years, the Mexican government did everything they could to bury that history. There was 150,000 dead on both sides, 250,000 refugees who came to Texas mostly. And this went on for 3 years. They talk about the Mexican Revolution. Hopefully I won't chase too many rabbit holes on this deal. But they say the Great Mexican Revolution, the Gran Revolution de Mexico, or Mexicano. The only thing great about it was the killing. Officially went on from 1910 to 1920. In that time, they not only had killing at a genocidal proportion, they also had the first pandemic, the Spanish flu. And believe me, it hurt them a lot worse than it ever did us. And they also had a huge lack of food. Their entire infrastructure broke down. People were starving to death. It was a great famine during that time. In 1917, the revolutionary leaders, after all the things that had gone on, let's cross, double cross, triple cross each other, they finally got together. And they came up with a constitution in 1917. I think the last one they had was in 1857. This was a very secular document. In fact, it had an Article 130, who several people have tried to disavow since then, that basically said that the church, as the Catholic Church, can only go about its business with the government's permission. Now, this was written into there. There was a strong communist influence in Mexico during this time. You notice the date 1917. Well, we know what was happening in Russia in 1917. A lot of that got exported over here or into Mexico. But nobody paid much attention to this document as far as Article 130 until a certain cat by the name of Plutarco alias Calles came along. He was one of the revolutionary leaders from Sonora, state of Sonora. And he was one of the few that actually died a natural death, which kind of points to how intelligent he was, how conniving he was, and how utterly bloodthirstily ruthless he could be. Calles took over in the mid-1920s and immediately made it where the Catholic Church, even a priest, could not have public mass without permission from the government. And one thing led to another. They were turning Catholic churches, iglesias, into stables for horses. You had leaders in Mexico who were not just atheists. They were militant atheists. They could not accept anything but atheism. They had no care or no caring for any kind of religion, especially Catholic. Those are the Catholic faith. So basically what happened, those who were loyal to the Catholic faith waged war against the Mexican government for the next 3 years. And that lasted the summer of 1929. One anything interesting about that, people think the revolution ended in 1920. Actually, in those years, you had two other revolutions going on, rebellions. One was by General Escobar in Coahuila, and that was ended in around March, April 1929. And the Yaqui Indians were in revolt again. It was a mess. My book takes place with a retired ranger who was a scout for General Pershing during the expedition. He had some personal affairs involved in this because his ranch was raided on the Cinco de Mayo raid of Glen Spring in 1916 at Lower Big Bend. For the next 7 years, he scouted for Pershing and waged a one-man war against the Villa forces, the Villistas. In 1929, he receives his Leland semi-return. Same ranch, same family as in my first historical novel, Destiny's Way, but this is a half a century earlier. And he's made contact, or he's contacted by a man that he befriended and befriended him, who was a colonel in the Mexican cavalry, that became a Cristero. He goes, it's fixing to come to an end. It's not going to be pretty. Get my family out of here. So he goes all the way down into near the state of Durango, below Escalon. And he brings this family out being pursued by bandits, the Mexican army, the American army, in the desert itself in the middle of summer.
So actually what I wanted to ask is change the focus again to any upcoming book signings you might have in the Hill Country.
Yes, sir. Matter of fact, Vicky Schroeder has, I have a couple of contacts down in the Hill Country. People really like my stuff down there. Some of my biggest big book signings, tours, talks, and things of that nature occur down there. And she set up a series here at the end of May. I'm supposed to be at the Kerrville Public Library from 3 to 5 p.m., May the 29th. That'd be a Thursday. Then for the opening of the summer reading program at the Bandera Library on Friday the 30th from 6 to 8 p.m., I believe. And I'm going to spend all day long with a gentleman that's been a big supporter of mine there at the Bandera General Store, Glenn McComb. I just go in and I sit down, and people coming, people going. We start visiting. I got a pile of books there. We always have a good time, but nobody's gone to jail yet over it.
I hope to meet you when you come to Kerrville then.
I look forward to that, sir.
Ben, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information about yourself, certainly to find out about your books, or maybe even connect, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
I heartily encourage them. The first stop should be my Facebook page at Ben H English. I keep right at the maximum of friends on that Facebook friends on there. Very active. Each week I'll put out at least one article. I'll call it Somewhere in the Lower Big Bend. It'll be about a 500-word essay and photograph of places that people don't know anything about. A little bit of culture, a little bit of history, that sort of thing. I also put special things there. Like right now I'm doing my Cristeros thing, and I'm explaining some of the firearms in the history that are explained, that are described in the book itself and their importance. You can also go to X, what they call Twitter these days, under Ben H English. You can also go to my website at benhenglish.com. Any of those three places, I post things up. I have a very active Facebook page. Yeah, my publisher told me that I have a lot of advantages as a writer. He goes, but your biggest advantage is your readers. He goes, they are absolutely rabid. So we get in there, we visit all the time. And then also at my book tours and my signings and such, we may start inside someplace, but they close the joint down, we'll be standing out there on the sidewalk underneath the shade tree talking about whatever. I enjoy my readers. My readers are very important to me, because without them, not only would I have nobody to write for, but I wouldn't have anybody to write about, because they're my people. They're where I come from.
Ben, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me. We're going to post this before you come to Kerrville, so we'll be able to get a little more information out on your book signing in Kerrville. There's a couple of places I might suggest you visit in Kerrville that help get the word out about you and your books. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate you having me, and I'm looking forward to those conversations myself. I think you got a story or two yourself to tell.